Thanks for coming here today, and thanks to everyone who's out there in the ethers listening or checking it out online. My name is Pamelia Stickney, and I play the theremin as one of my many weird hobbies. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with this instrument, and most people think of a synthesizer as an instrument that has, a keyboard on it, like that resembles a piano, let's say. But before we had keyboard synthesizers, we had the theremin, which was a really rare instrument. Most people are familiar with the instrument just by sound. We make reference to it in pop culture. Even children, not knowing what a theremin is, will sometimes make this woo noise, to imply of something spooky or haunted. Well, maybe I'll put on a tiny sound sample of a pop culture reference to the instrument that, well, it's before my time, but everyone's, I'm sure, heard of that film, The Day the Earth Stood Still, when, the Martians are coming to planet Earth, and you can kind of hear this screeching. Well, that's funny. I'm waiting for the theremin to come back in. Well, maybe I could make a little bit of noise to it. So kind of like hamming it up with the extra vibrato. So usually we associate the instrument with kind of making spooky sounds or extra vibrato, and but the instrument also has kind of this not so well known history to it as well. Many of us might not have heard of the first virtuoso of the instrument, Clara Rockmore, and I can play a little sound sample of her playing because that was my introduction to the instrument, was seeing the documentary film Theremin, An Electronic Odyssey. Not knowing that I was going to be watching a documentary film that night, I was really pissed off at my boyfriend because he went to Blockbuster Video and I was like, let's watch some action film, and then he came home with a documentary and I was going to punch him in the face. And I was like, no, I don't want to see a documentary tonight, screw you. But then, within minutes of the documentary coming on, I just see this woman standing in front of this, what is this thing? What looks like a wooden box with two antennas coming out of it. One antenna coming out of the side with a loop, and then an antenna standing upright. And she's moving her hands in the air, and then immediately I could understand what she was doing when I heard her playing, and I was totally mesmerized, as I think most people who play this instrument or chose to continue with it have been from hearing and watching someone play. So here's Clara. So that's at least an example sampling of what I first heard, because I didn't realize that the theremin was something that could sound so vocal, and most people wonder, oh, how does it get that vibrato? And most electronic instruments, you might have this little tiny pitch wheel on it to try to fiddle around with, but there's something freeing about having nothing to hold on to. You can experiment with doing a slight wavering with your hand in the air or fingers to be able to create a vibrato. Well, let me show you how it looks when I do it. So how many of you are composers out here? Oh yeah, and Sasha too. So I just want to let you know that whenever you have any questions that come up, I welcome you to raise your hand, and don't feel like you're interrupting, because I really like being spontaneous and going with the flow, and I want to make sure that also what I'm talking about is relevant to what you're curious about as it's going along. And when you raise your hand, then Sasha will pass a microphone to you so that everyone who's online listening will be able to hear your question. Otherwise, it'll be kind of like Jeopardy. Like, they're going to hear the answer, and it's like, what was the question? And they don't get a prize, So, let's see. Maybe the next thing I'm going to talk about, well, it's not on this list. I have the wrong page up. Well, for the composers out there, you might be curious about, repertoire. There's not a wide range of repertoire for this instrument. The fact that it's only 100 years old. The beginning of its existence, there were not that many instruments around. There were some custom-built ones by the inventor himself. And then the RCA company had produced a small, like a limited run of theremins, but because this instrument is very difficult to mass produce and have produced in a way that there would be a really good quality control, or there wasn't back then, it made the instrument even more difficult to understand and to figure out how to play. It's not like back then people could go to YouTube and find some captured performance as an example of what's possible. And to understand, you have to do things like calibrate the instrument to your body and room, because it's functioning as you're taking part in an electromagnetic field with your body. So that whole concept, I don't even understand very well myself. I'm not a scientist, but back then it must have been even more mysterious, for people to try to figure out or wrap their heads around that, you're just making this movement in the air and changing a pitch with one hand and then the volume with the other hand. And to not know if you can make adjustments to the spaces between your notes. I think that was part of the reason that so many of the sci-fi film soundtracks, the theremin parts are very limited, because some people might not have had instruments that had more than a 1 or 2 octave range. And so that limits what key you could be doing a melody in, and the spaces between the notes on the older design instruments. It's like a string instrument, logarithmic, that the lower notes will be wider apart and gradually get closer and closer together. So that adds to the difficulty of trying to figure this thing out. But Clara Rockmore, she had a close friendship with the inventor, and she originally was a classically trained violinist, and she understood what she wanted to try to get from the instrument and had a knack for it when she was playing it. And it was in 1920 that Theremin had given a sort of an introduction or presentation of the instrument for the public to see, and that's when she heard and saw it. and was like, wow, I need to try this thing. And when she worked together with him, a lot of advancements had happened with the instrument, as she demanded more octaves, and she demanded the volume control of it not be so gummy. And what I mean by that is, if you come up to an instrument that might not be so well built, your volume might not go from absolute silence to gradual loud. It might always be on, so you'll always have a glissando happening. Or it might, to not be able to play the silence can be detrimental if you're trying to create the illusion of having separated notes. So what's unique about this instrument is you play the silence to create the illusion of singing voice or melodies. Hi. Do you have any questions so far? No? Oh no. I'm like, oh yes. Oh, hang on, let me get the microphone for you. Dun, 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 dun. Here's the microphone getting music. Dun, 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 dun.
The difference between your right hand and your left in terms of what they're doing, and the tall piece there, the higher you put your hand, does the octave change in that case? Or I'm sorry, I'm probably jumping the gun, and you were going to explain all of that.
No, because I sometimes take for granted, like what people understand of this instrument.
I've heard of a theremin, and I love the sound, but I don't know anything about it really. So I was just watching your hands, and I thought, oh, that's very interesting. So
yeah.
So thank you.
You're welcome. So they're really good questions, because many people, when they think high note, low note, it's a natural tendency to want to move your, let's say, the pitch control hand up and down. But I'll demonstrate so you can hear how it's changing. It is changing a little bit, but if I'm doing it towards and away from this antenna, it makes a much bigger difference. So what you're trying to do is, you imagine there's a sphere around this antenna. Let's say that that's sensitive up to like a 3-meter radius around this antenna. And I think of like if you're entering into a pool of water or the bathtub, when a little bit more of your body goes into the tub, you displace a lot more water. And that's how I think of working with this instrument. Not only does my body affect it, if someone I'll hold a note and Sasha can walk up to me. So yeah, it's like, hey, you're stepping in the tub. Hey, it's overflowing. Yeah. And that's part of that's also when someone has no understanding of how the instrument works, and oftentimes, in the past at least, there would be theremins for sale in a music shop, and people would come in curious to check it out, but it could seem hopeless if you don't understand how it works, and you're trying to just hold a steady note, and you don't realize that all of the people walking around you are affecting it. I think that was part of why this instrument was dismissed or not taken seriously, because it seemed like the instrument was unstable, but it was really just able to read what was happening around it and misinterpret it. And my other hand is the volume hand. So when I pull my volume hand away from this antenna, it'll gradually get louder. Yeah. And so it's like working stick shift. It takes a while to get used to having your hands do completely different functions. But once you get the hang of it, no, you never do actually. I like to say it's like you're always a beginner with this instrument, and that's a liberating thing, because it's like no one can tell you you're doing something the wrong way, and the goal is you want to be happy with what comes out of it. But you can't come to any instrument, in fact, I don't think. It doesn't make sense to come with expectations. It should be more a personal development that within you as you're exploring something. So you can think of it like going into a cave, but you're not going to die in there at least, and so you can explore how it's interacting with you, what's possible with it, and I have one student that comes to my workshops, and it's really funny because he has his own idea of what to do with a thing, and it's incredible. He can make it sound like a woman orgasming. It's hilarious. And and he performs live with it, and it's amazing because it's like I don't know how to do that, but he figured it out, and he's using it in a completely different way, but it's incredible. So yeah, I like the idea of approaching something and seeing what's possible, and keeping an open mind. So that's the positive aspect of there not being any tradition to this instrument. And the great thing too is because there aren't such high expectations, then it's really wonderful when people then start bringing, composing music for it, and and using it also in traditional ways, treating it as a solo voice, or treating it, like in a way that you would treat like a soloing, electric guitar. You have a question there?
So someone online is asking, and maybe this will come up over the course of the presentation, but specifically about notation and how, like, once the composer gets into that mode of writing, how exactly they prepare it in like a traditional notation system.
Oh, totally. That's a great question because, we have also the tradition of notational systems, and then there's new music styles and improvised music. But I can show you here. I don't know, where is the camera? Are these all cameras here? But I can hold it up so you can see it. This is about to be performed in a few minutes, and the composer Sasha Rapoport is sitting back there, and he'll be speaking a little bit about his. He's written 3 sonatas for the theremin and piano, and so you can see the notation is, it's in treble clef. Occasionally there's bass clef because my instrument has more octaves on it that we could make use of. There's, you can still write in glissandos in the usual way that's familiar. And a lot of people then sometimes ask, well, how do you know what note you have? And it's the same thing as being a vocalist. So when you're composing for a thereminist, you just think of the person you're composing for, because some people might have hard times with really strange intervals. And also, there are some limitations with how you get around on this instrument. For example, there are things that you might write for another instrument that does something like this, and you're not going to easily pull something like that out of this. It sounds like washing the windows, but you could actually put that in window wash in the notation, or you just write octaves going really fast, and then window wash, for theremin. Copyright it quick, So some people ask, well, how would you figure out writing for it then? And a really good start is to think of the limitations that a vocalist might have, because you also wouldn't normally have a vocalist do these quick octave jumps unless you wanted the effect that happens. I can play an example of something that's normally written for voice from Alban Berg, except played on a theremin, and the jumps and everything that happen in there and the way that it can be shaped works very well on the theremin. ways that you can climb around and also another thing to keep in mind when you're composing for a thereminist, you need to find out what is the vocal range of their instrument. So just like writing for vocalists, some people are, like a bass voice or have a really high voice, and that also depends on the model of instrument. No two theremins, even of the same brand, make, and model, will have the exact same vocal range. And I've noticed that with there are the Moog Etherwave models, which I'm always recommending to people to buy as their first instrument. Some of them will be more like a mezzo-soprano range, that's the sweet spot. Some will be, almost even down to being like almost a cello, where the sweet spot is. And what I mean is where it's very comfortable for your hand in the air to play it. And so you want to try to find out the comfortable playing range for the musician, and how many octaves they've got. And then you have to also keep in mind, how easily they can get around to make really big jumps. Because if you give them a really huge pitch jump, and they have a very short amount of time to go from playing a lower note, and they have to 3 octaves away reach somewhere, it's really difficult to make that jump and to find your place in the air. And so sometimes you have to work it out with the musician and see, do you want them to glissando up to that, or having flexibility depending on what it is that you want them to do, and how to create a place where they can find their note before coming in, if that's necessary. And some players, they actually will use a tuning device, an external tuner, like guitarists might have, so that their signal can run through, and in silence they'll grab the thing. But I carry too many pedals. I'm just like, screw it. Not another thing to carry. I want to carry makeup, or like an extra pair of shoes, not a pedal. Does anyone have questions so far? Okay, hang on. We'll pass the microphone.
That was actually a good segue. I wanted to ask you about pedal work with the theremin.
Okay. Do you have a specific question regarding pedal work?
Like guitar pedals, pitch shifters, anything that will modulate the sound?
Yes.
Do you do any of that?
Oh my gosh, totally. So I'll tell you what I have here with me. I have 2 looping pedals. And how I have my configuration today is I'm sending my signal first to one looping pedal. Then that signal runs through a microsynth pedal made by Electroharmonics. And I've just turned it on now so you can hear. It gives it octaves, and it's possible for me to also change the color of the tone. And then what I have that then running through, or actually just before it, is a harmonizer. I have it set to fifths right now, but it's possible with this particular pedal to change the interval, the secondary interval that's shooting out. You can have the voice of the instrument itself, but you can adjust the interval underneath it and the volume level of it, and then as well on the top. And then I have all of that then running into a second looping pedal. So it's possible then, I do a lot of concerts alone by myself. And some people ask, well, how do you do that? Because it's a monophonic instrument. It's like only one voice at a time. And so I thought of a way to be able to build multiple voices. And so that's why I thought, looping pedals would be a great way to start, at least to give at least some sense of polyphony. So maybe what I'll do is I'll build a little loop, and then you can hear as I make a tiny loop, and I can talk you through what's happening with the pedals as I click things on, and you can hear how a simple loop can then be manipulated. Whoops. Here's clean signal. So for fun, I could, let's say, bring in the harmonizer. You're going to hear a secondary. So now I have a minor sixth harmonizing underneath the original. And if I wanted to bring it back to the original voice here and mess around with having a secondary harmonizing above, and here's major third. So I could, let's say, like go back and forth between oh no, here's major third. I'll go back and forth between minor third above or a flat sixth underneath. Or I could take the original signal out and the whole thing is just pretty much being transposed between two different interval sets. But you can then play it live as well. So that's just like playing around with live processing and harmonizers, that you can have this option to suddenly have polyphonic voices, adapt things in it, and it seems like a strange. Well, it would take a lot longer to write that down and then find the musicians to like go play that. A hog. Oh, the pedal I'm using, it's called Pitch Bay, and it's made by Earthquaker Devices. Yeah, and it's a digital harmonizing pedal. So you can also use, pitch shifting pedals, like there's Digitech Whammy. And because this instrument already is a big pitch shift, what's cool is if you had a loop running through it, you could then pitch shift, the whole loop without changing the speed of it. And there are other, interesting tricks and things that you can do, well, especially working with looping. Say like I wanted to play this loop through the micro synth now. And I'm going to put a tiny tail of a delay into the second looping pedal. And I'm bringing the trigger up, stop frequency down, a little bit of square wave, some resonance, and now when I play a bass note, it's going to trigger and open up the loop that's running through, that's a little bit muted right now. So you can hear the notes of the chord that's in passing above it, just from doing that. Whoops. So yeah, like what's cool is you can then suddenly you might have the harmonies that are playing in the background from that loop, and then you will open up those note volume levels coming out from what's inside the loop, but then you can redefine the harmonies by playing a totally, a bass line that's not following that rule, let's say, and it gives you freedom to actually improvise something or treat your bass sound as a solo voice, and no matter what, the opening of the filter for those chords to suddenly come out, it makes it totally tight. So then it's as if, the string section is completely lined up with your bass sound that you're playing. And so if you're playing with a drummer, let's say, then you have something that can be very quickly synchronized and spontaneous, but together, and still with the freedom to harmonically take things a different direction without being trapped in loopland. A lot of pedals work really great to run the theremin through. Some things might not work so well. Some people try to use a wah-wah pedal, but to get the wah-wah pedal to work well, you need to add a little bit of thickness to the color of the sound, because the sound by itself is very clean. And so to give more harmonics for the wah-wah pedal to grab onto, a really good thing to try is running it through a chorus. And what a chorus does is it's playing back the voice you put in, but giving a slightly off-pitch version next to it. So then you suddenly have those fighting pitches against each other that gives a lot more for the wah-wah pedal to grab onto, so then you can start to hear the filter going wah, wah. Yeah, and so that's also helpful when you're trying to, add like a distortion, because when you have such a clean sounding voice. But the other thing about these instruments is you also have different tone colors, capabilities from the instrument without using any pedals. So with this one, I can have a voice that's very buzzy, or you can hear the quality of it change. Oh, there's that horrible, I don't like that sound, unless it's for a joke. And that one's another clean version. No two models have the same capabilities for adjusting the sound to get the exact same setting. So it's something you have to play around with, depending what instrument the player has. Are there other questions? Yes. Oh, get the microphone.
Can you explain a bit the physicality of your hand when moving around the pitches?
Yeah. So maybe what I do is I try playing a scale so you can see what it looks like. So I'm not using a standard technique, and there are some standardized techniques out there floating around. That's something also to keep in mind when you're writing for the theremin. There are certain types of lines that might not be possible with certain types of techniques. And and so it's really important when you have an idea for writing for the instrumentalist, well, you want to hear what it is that they're capable of doing already so far, and or try to search out when there's a type of line that you want to write, and to make sure that you hear that someone is doing that line and how it's executed that you want it to be, because there's some techniques that people might use that's and I don't really use that technique because I like to be able to it's like working with a one-string violin. I want to set myself up for what's coming next. And so I find that I don't know how to describe it really, because I don't even think about what I'm doing. It's an evolution over time when you're working with the instrument, and depending on what it is you want to accomplish with it next as you get your technique down. So it's normal at first to move your whole hand to find a melody. But it's not so efficient because you have to move your whole arm. And so eventually with time, the idea at least that worked for me was to involve smaller muscle movements so that I can land in a specific place with less margin of error. And that's, you can't just jump immediately to working that way, because at the same time you're developing your ear to understand sharp and flat. But that's not, I'm not strict about, having to be in tune, because it just depends on the goal of what the musician envisions doing with the instrument. And so when you're composing for it, you have to also be very aware of who you're writing for, and it's there are things that require effort, like especially what Sasha's written for me. It's lines I would not typically choose to do, but then it opens me up to realizing, oh, this is possible. Oh, I have to practice this or that. Oh, okay, that can work. Sasha, shall we introduce? Well, this is Sasha Alexander Rapoport, and he's a composer and musician and friend. Yeah. Okay. So I wanted you to talk about your piece.
Yeah, I'd love to talk a little bit about how I came to the theremin and how I came to write the piece you're about to hear. I got to know Pam through Tessie, the pianist who is also my wife, about 8 years ago, and in Vienna. And at first I did some arrangements for them. And then the idea arose that perhaps I would write an original piece. And the result of that, excuse me a second, was my first sonata for theremin and piano, which I wrote from a point of almost complete ignorance. But I had the advantage that I was writing for Pam. And Pam is much too modest, but she can play virtually anything. And I learned a lot about the instrument in the two subsequent sonatas that I've written. I believe that Pam has very eloquently articulated the idea that one of the advantages of the theremin is that it is such a young instrument, and really there is so little that is excluded, and it can be a wonderful stimulus for the imagination. I think that every composer must find his or her own ideas that arise from getting to know the instrument and thinking about it. And sometimes I think it can lead to wonderful surprises. For me, I discovered that writing for theremin and piano, perhaps paradoxically, actually made it possible to do one of the things that I love doing best, which is writing in a way which is informed by tradition, specifically the tradition of Viennese classicism that I grew up with and loved so much. That does not mean that what you're about to hear sounds like anything by Haydn or Mozart or Beethoven or Schubert, but I do use classical structures, and I use a classical approach to tonality. I find that if I were to write a solo piano piece, or even a piece for violin and piano and cello or piano, cello and piano, one of the things that can easily happen is that the listener does not really listen if I want to incorporate materials that are informed by the classical tradition. The listener is going to go, oh, sounds like Haydn. Oh, sounds like Brahms. When we put the theremin into the mix, the first impulse of the listener is astonishment. Even if you've heard the theremin before, it's only 100 years old. You will necessarily be astonished to hear that. And that actually gives me the freedom to use classical structures without being pigeonholed, because I find that people will really listen to what is in the piece. The other thing that I think is wonderful is the fact that the theremin blends so beautifully with traditional instruments although it's an electronic instrument, and this is not always the case. I find it's much easier to write for theremin and piano than it would be to write for electric guitar and piano, for example. And I think this has to do with the enormous flexibility that you have in vibrato and intonation. The piece that Pam and Tessie are about to play is Act 2 from my Sonata number 3 for theremin and piano. I divided the third sonata into acts and scenes. This comes out of a feeling that I have that music and theater are not only closely related, but actually are the same thing. They are ways of telling a story over time. And we're conditioned to think that music is only sound. But I think that so much of music is gesture, and this is another wonderful thing about the theremin. We always want to see the performer and what the performer is doing. This is a nice example of how I use classical structures. This movement begins with a march, which is written in a very classical, rounded binary form. So it is ABA. It has a trio, which is then fast, and then gets back into the march, which has a kind of a distorted reprise. But then this act has two different scenes. The second scene of this second act is a minuet, and you'll hear that as well. Before I turn things over to Pam and Tessie, I would like to say that if you are in Toronto on November 16th, there will be a concert at Heliconian Hall where all three of my sonatas will be played. And you can find this in the whole note. You can find information about the concert fairly easily. But there are still tickets, and you'll get the chance to hear Pam and Tessie play for a whole evening.
Thanks, Sasha. And here's Tessie Rauba coming up onto the piano. And I do this oftentimes because I'm just making sure that the instrument is still calibrated to how I need it to be. So, yeah, if you want, I can pass this around. You can see what the notes look like to what just got played, because now you've heard it, then you can see how it looks. And yeah, that's it. It helps sometimes to see what does it look like, and you'll see all of the lines for the roop roop, and there are funny names that Sasha made for some things, like yappy dog, like woof woof, because it's like, it's like, how do you describe it? And then sometimes just by the description, then you figure out, what do I do with my hands to make a yippy dog? And it's like, oh, So does anyone have questions so far right now? I guess there are a couple of questions. How about the young woman in the back row there? Hi.
So first of all, thanks for just wonderful playing. So
Thanks.
yeah, my question is, how much does the environment, like humidity and temperature, affect the sound of the instrument? Like, can you play it outdoors? Will it be the same versus inside? If it's really cold, like if you're playing in the snow, what difference would it make? Something
They're
like
good
that.
questions, because these are things that I had to learn along the way from playing, like, sometimes outside. I once had this really cool gig in Italy, and it's like, yeah, like, do you want to play in the castle or outside? And I thought, oh, it's summer, yeah, like, I'll play outside. And they set up the stage and we sound check and everything's really great. Then I'm supposed to play at midnight, and I didn't realize it's typical, like a heavy wind picks up in the evenings there. And it was like, oh no, disaster, because the wind was blowing so hard that, it was making the theremin itself rock on the stage, and it was even blowing my body on the stage, so I had no control. So luckily it was a very flexible gig where I wasn't playing, classically. I wasn't playing with other people where we're doing written songs with written notes, and I was doing an improvisation, so I just had to kind of adapt to the situation and go into the out there realm of dealing with what's completely out of my control at that point. And so, heavy wind, not such a good thing if you want control. High humidity, I didn't realize until last summer. Like, I was in Portugal, and sound check was great because it wasn't so humid in the early afternoon. And the evening came in, and then some fog rolled in, and we got onto the stage, and I was with the band, and I thought someone spilled water on the stage because it was just so wet, but it was really the humidity. And we start playing the first song, and everything seemed okay, but then towards the end of the first song, that was only 5 minutes long, the range on my instrument was shrinking. And so I had, like, between my body and the antenna, you can see and hear what I normally have here. Well, what happened was, like, it sounded like this. And that was it. Like, I had no range, and I couldn't adjust the instrument, and so I thought, oh no, it might be broken. But I had a hunch that it would be the humidity, because of when I thought of that idea of the bathtub of water, let's say, and you're stepping into it. Well, if there's a bunch of water, humidity in the air, and then it's like all over my skin, it's all over the instrument itself too. Like, you could wipe the instrument and feel the humidity, and it's just in the air. I think that's what made the distances between the notes just like kind of like collapse into having like so little range. And I'd written to the manufacturers, it was like, oh my gosh, help, like, do you think this is it? And one of the techies there emailed back and said, well, if you can get, like, a really heavy duty heater on the stage to, like, scorch away the humidity, then that might work, I was like, I can't do that in the middle of a gig. And I took it back to the hotel later, and air conditioned room, there's no more humidity, and plugged it in, and nothing was broken, and that was a big relief. But that was lesson number 2. Like, okay, high humidity doesn't work when it's that sticky outside. If it's freezing, the hard part is if you're shivering, then you don't have control of your vibrato. Like, I had a lot of coffee this morning. Oops. So like you have to pay attention to, how much control you have with your body. Weather conditions, well, of course you don't want to play it in the rain because, and high temperatures, I haven't yet had problems playing in high temperatures when it's not humid. And yeah, that's it. Indoors versus outdoors, yeah, same thing. Either way could work. Indoors, the obstacles you might have could be interferences. Sometimes certain types of lighting systems and how everything is plugged into the electrical, system in the house of a venue. Let's say you might have like buzz sounds or interferences that cause a secondary pitch to come up with this, and in that case you sometimes try turning off lights that have dimmers on them to see if that might make a difference. Or like I went around the club trying to unplug things, like, can you unplug the fridge? I don't know. Or just we were trying to figure it out. And when you're on stage with other theremins, then you also have other problems that are posed when you have two of the same make or model and they're in the same frequency and you're plugged into the same, let's say, electrical circuit. You have strange things happen, like one person touches their volume antenna and the other person's pitch will jump. And so, there are a lot of technical difficulty things that you only discover as you play, figure it out, and if there's an engineer around with you to help with the problem solving, that's a great thing. Otherwise, you have to kind of figure it out by trial and error. And I was once standing by a wall and there must have been a lot of metal rods in it, and it wasn't possible to calibrate my instrument to have its full range. And so I just moved away from the wall. It's like, oh, okay. And playing with other musicians on stage, you have to be aware that you don't want the singer running around dancing around you and your instrument. So you're always trying to weigh out the situation of the distance between your instrument and the people in the audience. If you're playing in a living room all cozy, and just remembering to tell people, please stay still when I'm playing, please, please, And if you're, planning to check out a theremin, or attempt playing one for the first time, I always recommend to try leaning against a wall or sitting on a stool, because you might not realize how much your body moves when you're trying to just stand still. It's even if I just stay still here and say I breathe, and shifting the weight to the front of my feet. And that tiny difference, even though you don't hear much of a pitch change on the instrument when you're just holding a steady note, that shifting of your weight to the back of your heels could suddenly make the distances between your notes way smaller. And people sometimes ask, oh, well, do you pick a note to tune the instrument to? And it's it doesn't work that way. You want to check things relatively. So I usually check in each octave range how it feels just to do a whole step or a fourth. And that usually gives me an idea of how I want it. And also, you can make use of being able to expand the distances or collapse them as you're playing, because say you want a little bit more of vibrato control on your higher notes. If it's a little bit too close for you, you can also, let's say, you can make your vibrato go not towards the antenna, or you can move a lot of your body up closer to the instrument, and suddenly you have a more comfortable width for your notes. Whereas if it's here, see how tiny that is? And here. So you can adapt things without having to touch any of the knobs on the instrument. You have another question?
Question from Cyberland.
Okay.
Can you tell us a few words about traveling with the instrument?
Oh yeah, traveling with it. Well, I can tell you, like London Heathrow, or like some like London Luton. When you travel with the instrument, don't tell them it's a theremin. Say it's a bomb, you'll get through. No. But like, yeah, sure, yeah, fine. It's like, haha. But you just tell them it's a synthesizer, and when it goes through the X-ray machine, it is a synth. The internal guts of it look exactly like a keyboard synth, an analog synth. This I check under, but now because I don't, I get a little bit nervous. If I have connecting flights, then I'll carry the body of this with me because this model's no longer produced. I think that they don't let you bring this bit here because it could potentially be a weapon. It's got weight, it's wooden, it's like, I don't know, I think I could kick someone in the face harder with my foot and some high heels than to do as much damage with, like, I wouldn't want to hurt this. But anyways, I got stopped too because they didn't know what it was, because I forgot and left batteries in my pedals. If you leave batteries in your pedals and you're checking that with parts of your instrument, the batteries is what's going to throw them off. So remove your 9-volt batteries, whatever that's in your effects pedals, and that usually helps it get through without problems. But if you don't want to risk it and be called all the way back out past security to start all over again, I recommend you go to where the big machine is, where people take their oversized luggage, and you can go there before you get through security and let them scan it. And they'll say, what is this? And you say, oh, it's a synthesizer. And they open it and look at it. And then you don't have to go all the way back out and go through security again. 'Cause that's something I learned. Just in the English airports, they really make a thing over it. And it's terrible to, like, do 2 hours of security checks. You've got a question there?
So I'm used to theremin sounding with long and kind of lush phrases, not necessarily a lot of short attacks. But I noticed you were doing this with your right hand, and I even noticed in the score that says pits. So I guess my question is, how many articulations do you have?
Oh, that's a good question, because I've never thought about like counting them, but it's based on the instrument as well. With this one, it's possible to do really good pits, but you can also, I've figured out a way to control how long that you have a sustain with your like so-called pizzicato. So say like so it's possible to, have a more than even with an upright bass. You can choose how long you let it ring and how loud you want it to be before before the note goes to silence. And if you're working with pedals, sometimes they don't allow you to have that same control, and it might give a natural staccato to it. Like this microsynth pedal, it actually has a gate on there, so it doesn't so easily have it kind of does a start, stop. You can hear it click a little bit. So that changes also how you play it. And other articulations, I'm not sure. I guess you'd have to just say, can you do that? Can you do that? Can you do that? and then I would try to figure out, how would that be possible? And yeah. Does anyone else have questions here? Oh, yes.
I noticed that when you're playing, occasionally you'll have your left hand within the volume loop and you'll be playing vertically, but when you're doing things like your pizzicato, you have your volume hand a little behind the antenna, or at least that's how it looks from here.
Yes,
So
yes.
I'm curious as to, because I'm used to, using doing unconventional things to manipulate pitches, but that's an interesting way to manipulate the volume. So I'm curious as to how you discovered that and where that sort of unorthodox technique can be useful.
Oh, okay. Well, yeah, the idea was to not strain my wrist because, if you're doing this, it can be really strenuous on your wrist. So I thought, well, if the idea is to move away from the volume antenna, then you could use your thumb as a place to time keep. And when your thumb is at just the right position in the air and your fingers then tap onto it, then it's not as strenuous to just tap your fingers. Yeah, and there are other weird things you could try doing, like that gets tiring after a while, but otherwise, like, okay, tremolo pedal, or I give up. Okay, I don't have a bow. Darn. It is a bit of a trick too that my pitch hand I have developed in some way. The idea of giving myself a sense of something to hold on to, because you're in the air. There's nothing to grab onto, but the surface of my own hand becomes like a fingerboard for itself. So when you can see where these fingers might move as a group together and then come back to a resting place on my thumb rather than some place in the middle of the air. And I found that to make it easier to really land in a place and come to a complete stop. And yeah, it's just many, many small movements, and it takes time to develop that, and also I'm always telling people, don't rush it. You have to build up the muscle memory. So I once saw a martial arts class where they were working with big, huge sticks, and they had to swirl it around and like do a big circle and hit an X on the ground. And when people would swing too fast, and it would never hit the X on the ground, and that's kind of insanity. So what you had to do was train yourself very slowly to pull it in a big circle, and every step of the way until you land on that X. And so you're training your muscle memory and the whole muscle groups to do that huge motion, and eventually you can do it faster and faster. And that's kind of like when you're working with training the stopping and start, or the stopping points for your fingers. Otherwise, you'll be shooting and it's like, oh, too high, too low, too high, too low, and you'll never develop a sense of muscle memory. And then it makes it hard to continue on from there. I'm trying to think of how much time we have left, and if there are other questions that anyone has that might be even more out there. And there's no such thing as a beginner question, because oh, hang on, let me get you the microphone so that everyone can hear.
I'm such a newbie at this. Are Theremins hard to purchase? Like, are they available in Toronto to purchase?
I believe they are, or even a music shop could order one for you. So like the
big type of person.
well, yeah, I mean, like, seriously, even people who've been playing this for eons and years, it's like you discover you're always a beginner with this thing because you always hit a wall with it. What I recommend for a first model, it's by the Moog company, Moog, and it's called the Etherwave. Not the digital one. They have a digital one that to me, I think it seems counterintuitive, and there's a little bit too many buttons and goodies all over it and effects. And yeah, but to get acquainted with, there are only 4 knobs on there. So you have a knob for adjusting the calibration of the volume antenna, And what that means is not how loud the instrument is, but how far you need to move away from it to get full volumes, the sensitivity. And then there's another knob for just adjusting, calibrating the instrument to the distances between the notes that are comfortable for you. And then there are 2 more knobs, and those are for making changes to the waveform, like the sound color and how bright it is, like ee or ooh. And that's it. It's just 4 knobs to deal with. And it's, you know, and since I've already explained to you the sensitivity of it, you know, be careful not to be too close to a wall or people moving around. Then just with those tips all by itself, then that's the perfect instrument for, you know, testing its sensitivity and try holding very, very still with your body, and then to, you know, slowly move to another note. And I tell people, if you have a refrigerator or something in the background, that you can try matching, or like this buzz that you hear, try matching that little sound in the background or harmonizing with it, to get acquainted with the, oh, do I want to move this far or that far? And yeah. Yeah.
Very interesting instrument. You play beautifully. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Hi. Would you be able to talk about what strategies you use for practicing the instrument, particularly techniques like staccato that are more difficult?
Yeah. What's funny is I don't practice. It's like so boring. It's more. You know, I always tell people, like, say like there's a song or a melody that you really, really want to play, and you start with that. And you start with the, you know, when you then hear, oh, I want to get the staccato going on. It's a real individual, feat to accomplish, to figure out the most comfortable way to do these maneuvers, because the instrument is so, it's such a physically challenging thing to not have anything to hold on to, and you can really hit so many walls of insanity, trying to do something over and over again, and then it won't improve, or there could be factors that might change. So I always think that, if there's something that you really want to make it do, you hear something and you have it in your head, and then you just have to kind of play around with it and see how many different ways. So if one way doesn't quite work so easily, also I tell people, try standing on the other side of the instrument, because sometimes you discover, oh, I'm not right-handed on it, I'm left-handed on it, and this is way easier that way around. It's happened a few times with students where it's like, stand on the other side and try it, and then it's like, oh my god, that clicks better. Because you're making very fine movements with both hands, but very different types of fine movements. And so the hand you write with, I'm left-handed, but I play string instruments, and I find that the pitch control with the left hand makes a lot of sense. So it could be an advantage that I'm left-handed with writing and experience with strings the right-handed way, because the fine movements that you need to make to write letters are very similar to the fine muscle groups that you need to control the pitches, if that's what you're shooting for. And for practicing, I guess, say like you want to work on a smooth legato, because that's a very difficult thing with this instrument, is to try to give the illusion of, to take away the glissando between 2 notes, but to not have the sound of like separation, like silence between notes, because it's a natural tendency that your hands want to do the same thing at the same time, open, close, jump, jump. I'll show you what it looks like. So it's a very subtle movement here, but first if you just focus on pitch hand, and then you think of this like a blinking light, and you find a place in the air where it goes to silence, but don't overshoot it and go too far or too low. So you have to get used to stopping your volume hand from going deeper into silence than you need to go. And you can see it's a very tiny, tiny space there, but if you're in the wrong position in the air, nothing happens. And with this hand, you'll do things separately. Like you'll not pay attention so much to your volume hand, and say like you work on the pitch hand, and you work with just the small distance intervals, and don't try to make yourself jump right away. Like say like minor thirds. Like I've been doing this forever now, so I can jump to it, but I recommend that you bend to the note that you want to get to and stop before you overshoot it. And if it takes time to get your ears trained to remember the original note, because it's sliding as you get there. So if you have something in the background, you know, shooting off a pitch, then that might be helpful that you start with that, and then reach for the interval and stop before you overshoot it. And then you're doing like that stick training to like stop in the same place. And then when you have that down, then you can start mixing together between these two hands. And then another thing is you could disregard the perfectness, let's say, that you're shooting for of the pitch hand, but just to get the coordination down between the two hands doing very different things. If you just watch, like, say like you're tapping on a tabletop, you're, you know, next note, up, down, because sometimes they move at the same time, and then it goes, wah! But what you want to do is have this come up, and then, and it's okay to have silence, move this to the next place. The starting point of like what practicing would look like on where it's like, you know, it's kind of you have to be kind of a little bit OCD with anything. I think that if you're really into it, it won't seem like practice. It'll be like this obsessive thing that keeps you up all night and like banging your head against the wall, like nah. But it's rewarding when the things start to come together. But it kind of begins with just, you know, hearing a melody that you really want to try to make happen with it, and to figure out how can I make it sing, and you'll pay attention to hearing, you know, like these little tiny glides that someone might do with their voice, and then, oh, how can I make this do that too? And so, yeah, it's an exploration. Are there any other questions yes, there's one more question here.
I'm just wondering, this is a little unconventional, but would it work if you were wearing gloves to play it, or if you use like an object to play it, like let's say mallets? Like would that would that work?
It would work because you know, it depends what the object you're holding is made of. If it's made of metal, then it's going to react to that. But if the object you're holding doesn't conduct electricity, then it'll be reacting to the movement of your body. And if you're wearing gloves, it might restrict, you know, the movements you'll make with your hands. But usually gloves aren't made of a material that will have such an effect. But if they did, it just becomes part of your body in the same way that, like, I'm wearing, you know, metal jewelry, but it's touching my body and it's already a part of it. And so it only has an effect in that it's adding more mass into this field, and that's all. And as long as it's moving with me, then it won't be such a disturbance. But if I'm wearing gloves that are too thick, then I might not have as much control over my muscle movements, the really small ones. Yeah. And maybe we'll close up now with Tessie. Should we play a song together? It's a little like mellow piece. You can get all meditative, I know. Like, and if you, oh yes, it is by me. And it's called Sea Sky Berceuse, and I'll use a little bit of delay for it. Yeah. Thanks. So don't forget, if you're around Saturday, a week from today, hopefully see some of you there at the Heliconian Club. You'll get to hear the 3 sonatas, maybe a few really terrible jokes, I don't know. Or maybe after the show, I learned some really good bad jokes. And thank you again so much for coming out today, and for those who came online to listen and participate. I'm always happy with all the questions that come my way. So thank you.